There are lots of rumors out there about skinwalkers. Maybe I don't believe them. Maybe I think that coming from a different tribe makes me immune to their evil. Regardless of what I believe, there are things I've seen in the lonely places of Arizona that I cannot explain. The business of my family often takes us deep into the Navajo reservation and lends us to spending the night in a hotel or at a friend's place. However superstitious or practical you are, there can be no argument that those desolate desert roads are not always safe for travelers and locals alike after the sun sets. I know many people who have had dangerous encounters. On a trip to visit a relative near Canyon de Chile, we decided to attend an evening rug auction that took us a couple hours out of town. I was riding with my friend Jen, whose mother we were visiting. I would like to make a note that Jen is not the most stalwart of souls and is one of the more superstitious native people I know. On previous driving excursions, she's begged me to stop the car and take a different route after noticing an owl flying towards the road. I don't put much stock in omens. Anyhow, the auction hadn't ended by 9 p.m. or so, and Jen and I were getting antsy. We opted to head back to her mother's place early and let the rest of the family catch up with us. As Jen drove the two of us home on the empty 2-lane road, we quickly left all semblance of civilization behind for sheer night, which seemed even blacker in the shadow of the canyons. Jen had settled on the least fuzzy FM station she could find, and I was staring aimlessly out the window. That's when I noticed the dog. At first, it was just a flash of white in the corner of my vision, and then I craned my neck to get a good look. A big white German Shepherd was running parallel to our car, about 100 yards off the road and a little behind us. Something about it made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I knew we must have been going 40 or 45 miles per hour, but it was gaining on us. I could feel my heart rate pick up while I stared at it. As it came perpendicular to us, it began to draw up off of its feet until it was running on 2 legs like a human. When it turned its head to look at me, my stomach dropped. Even from that distance, I was sure I could see a red glint to its eyes, and a feeling of dread washed over me. I must have made a noise because Jen touched my leg and asked what was wrong. I glanced at her wordlessly and then gestured out the window. But as I turned back, the dog was gone. Not wanting to scare her, I told her the dark was playing tricks on me and closed my eyes, determined to sleep the rest of the way home. The next night, after a lot of food and even more visiting, I had holed up in my room to get ready for bed. I was staying in the 2nd floor of the house, and my window overlooked the street. The houses are fairly spread out, but the road is lined with street lamps, the nearest of which is less than a block away on the opposite side. I turned out my light and went to the window to pull down the shades so the light wouldn't keep me up. Fear hit me like a sucker punch when my eyes drifted across the road. There, in the light of the street lamp, was the German Shepherd. It was standing on its hind legs in a way that I knew canine anatomy should not allow, and it was staring straight back at me. From that close, it was obvious that it had deep red eyes and fur that was a yellowish white. I don't know how long we watched each other. I knew better than to stare it in the eyes, but I was too terrified to turn away. Finally, it dropped down to all fours and walked away. I slept with a knife next to my bed and the bedroom door locked that night. Some part of me thinks it was a skinwalker that I saw, a witch out hunting for trouble. I haven't been back to Canyon de Chile. I was spending a month with my cousins at my grandma's house. It was August, and my cousins' ages ranged from 10 to 15, and I was the oldest, being 15. They were 10, 13, and 14. We stayed up telling scary stories often, but one night a few weeks in, we decided to make a campfire out back. My grandma's house is in a rural suburb. The neighbors aren't too far when you're driving down the road to her house, but in the backyard, it's thick forest with man-made paths through it. Each house is on a hill, so only part of the basement was actually underground. That isn't important until later, though. So we're towards the east side of her yard, in a small patch of open land. You couldn't see the neighboring yards from there, and there were probably 3/4 mile to each side of us that belonged to my grandma. It was maybe 11 at night, and we were playing truth or dare after telling scary stories, and my 14-year-old cousin dared me and the 13-year-old to go walk through the paths for 10 minutes. I said yes right away, as I wasn't easily scared and was rather level-headed, but my younger cousin was a bit more hesitant. We didn't bring a flashlight because it wasn't pitch dark yet, and we could see enough to keep us alive. We were walking through the paths for about 5 minutes and could barely see the fire through the trees when we finally decided to turn. In the middle of the path was a large dog-like creature, hunched over, with its front hands an inch from the ground. What I remember most was how its eyes were so bright white, and it was humanoid dog-shaped, with a human-like head but a dog-like body, and human hands and feet. It looked right at us, and I was paralyzed with fear as it dashed away the opposite way from us, towards a creek that ran through the yard. Eventually my cousin and I screamed, and my other cousins and grandma ran to us. I don't remember much here because I was really disoriented and I couldn't think properly, but I did wake up in bed, so I assumed that I was brought up to the house. All the kids slept in the basement in a big room with sliding glass doors to the outside, as the room was on the side that wasn't underground. My bed was pressed against the big glass window, and I could see my cousins playing outside down below. The house is in Michigan, so it gets slightly chilly even in the end of August. And there was a slight breeze, so I put on a jacket and ran to join them outside, skipping breakfast, not wanting to miss out on anything fun. When I got down, I could tell they weren't playing, but rather running to get my grandma. Her dogs, both of them, were dead, ripped up. That night, we went to bed early. I woke up at maybe 2 a.m. because I felt something hit my head. My cousins were all sitting on the double bed opposite me on the other side of the room. There was one bunk and 2 double beds. The double beds for me and my 14-year-old cousin. They were being quiet and staring right at me. The 13-year-old nodded his head toward the window. I froze. They all looked afraid. I turned my head slightly to the side and I saw a really messed up looking face pressed to the window with gaping eyes looking down at me. I screamed as loud as I could, and it bolted. My grandma called the police after I told her what happened, and they found nothing. I went home after that, and I've never been there during the night again. I decided to join my best friend Karen for a 3-day stay at her grandmother's place on the res. Her grandmother lives near a place called Tuba City, Arizona, in the middle of nowhere, but surrounded by rural homes. We go to college together, and I was interested to know about Navajo tradition. The first day we stayed, it was pretty chill, nothing out of the ordinary, but then her grandma, who wasn't that old, around 67, said that a stray dog came out of nowhere and wouldn't leave. To me, it did act kind of strange, and it was ugly. It had a black shaggy coat and looked like a mix between a German Shepherd and a lab. That night, we were watching a movie in the living room. The living room had big windows that looked out into the front where the cars are parked, nothing fancy, and the curtains were wide open. Grandma was in the kitchen cooking dinner, and we were watching a movie. Next to the window is a medium-sized bookshelf and where DVDs are kept. Karen went to put a DVD in that we had just watched, but she freaked out because that stray black dog was staring at us through the window, standing on top of the wood box outside. It's not something normal dogs do from my point of view, or hers. Usually my dog, which is a house dog, scratches the door to be let in. Res dogs aren't house dogs, and dogs inside houses are frowned upon in Navajo tradition, meant to protect the house and owner. The other dogs seemed to stay away from it. Karen opened the door and yelled at it to get off the box. It ran off behind the shed. We went to Tuba City to get some groceries and came back to the house. The dog was nowhere to be seen, and there was nothing unusual. Grandma went to visit some people, so it was just Karen and I at this point. At about 5 o'clock, we heard someone trying to open the door. Both of us looked out since we hadn't seen or heard a car, and the dogs weren't barking. We were looking out the living room window to the door, and there was the dog trying to open the door with its paws. 2 paws wrapped around the brass doorknob, standing on its hind legs. I thought that was weird, but wasn't really freaked out. Karen was, though. She opened the door and chased it off. Grandma came back later, and Karen told her. Grandma didn't like what she had heard. We got ready to sleep, and we slept in the spare bedroom since it had 2 beds. One window had curtains and was opened a little. We turned off the light, but there was a sound coming from on top of the roof. We heard the pitter-patter of footsteps and scratching sounds and panting. It then sounded like it jumped off onto the large plastic water barrel they had. At first, we heard what sounded like barking, but as it grew louder, the other dogs seemed to be barking at something also. All of a sudden, something was running around the house barking, but it didn't sound like a dog. This barking sounded human. It was a deep male voice, barking like it knew that we knew it wasn't a dog. Then panting again by the window, and we started freaking out. Karen decided to open the curtains to look out. There was the stray dog on its hind legs, looking into our bedroom, but this time it stunk, and what I thought were 2 black holes in the neck, another pair of eyes, twinkled, and the paws were deformed-looking hands with overgrown, thick, sharp fingernails. We both screamed and shut the curtains closed, and Grandma came running through the door and saw it. The first thing she did was grab ashes from the fireplace, load 3 shells into the shotgun from under her bed, bless herself in Navajo, and go outside to shoot it, yelling in Navajo about how that thing wasn't welcome there and to get the hell out of there, for it to go linger somewhere else. Them both being traditional, the next day they called a medicine man to come over and put cedar in. He prayed over everyone with cedar smoke and an eagle feather, blessed the place, made us eat bitter herbs called eagle's gall, and gave me an arrowhead. Apparently I needed to carry one for protection, and a little pouch called corn pollen. The medicine man said the dog was a skinwalker. The body of the stray dog, which was killed by the skinwalker, made an illusion, so we wouldn't know it wasn't a real dog. He also said that they tend to harm people by using some sort of human bone straw to spit at someone and get human bones into them. Doctors can't detect it, but the medicine man that day pulled a piece of human skull out of Grandma's right shoulder. It was pretty big, about 2 inches long and 1 centimeter thick. It was real. We watched him pull it out of her. When I was a kid, my uncle and I were finishing up chopping firewood for my grandmother because it was getting dark. This was on the Navajo Res here in Arizona. Driving back on a dirt road at about 30 miles per hour, I had this awful sense of being watched. Before I could turn to look out my window, my uncle quickly shouted, "Don't." I completely froze. My heart felt like it was beating out of my chest, then completely stopped when I heard a tap tap on my window. My uncle sped up and was loudly praying in my native language. I didn't know what was going on and thought it was over until our truck suddenly dipped from the bed. My uncle then started saying, "Look at me and don't turn away," over and over. Then I heard it again. Tap, tap, but from the window behind me. It was getting harder for me to breathe and I wanted to cry. A minute or two passed and the truck dipped again. My uncle looked around and sighed. It was quiet besides the truck and the road. He looked at me and said, "We'll ask your father to do a prayer in the morning so the evil will forget our faces." I remember curling up on the seat and just staring at the radio, watching the time, listening to my uncle sing an old prayer till we got to my grandmother's house. I later called my uncle because I had a nightmare about that night. We talked about it for a bit. He said, "I didn't see faces, just eyes, like brake lights you see on the road. It watched you." Before hanging up, I tried joking with him about it. "Why didn't you just step on the brake when it was in the back?" No laughter, just a pause. Because it wasn't alone. Before I tell my story, I'll summarize what a skinwalker is, for those who may not know. A skinwalker is a being that uses witchcraft, kills an animal, and uses the skin as a disguise. It's mainly active at night, but will observe during the day. Its favorite disguise is that of a regular human. A skinwalker's most noticeable traits are yellow glowing eyes and decaying flesh. Anyway, I was heading to a small town in southern Utah with my wife and a couple of friends. We were on our way to see Lee, a friend of mine that we hadn't seen in a long time. We met up with him at his place and decided to hang out at a nearby lake. It was a typical quiet campsite with a fire pit and a couple of logs around it. We had a little picnic there and were exchanging stories and catching up with each other all day. Eventually, one of my friends, Bryce, got tired and decided to fall asleep in the car while the rest of us continued talking. At this point, Twilight had fallen. Erica and I were discussing something while my wife and Lee were talking about something else. All of a sudden, my wife and Lee fell silent. Erica and I quickly noticed. We looked at them and Lee says, "Get in the car." I asked him, "What's wrong?" And he says, "There might be a Skinwalker around." Now, Erica and I had no idea what a Skinwalker was at the time, so we asked him to explain. After his explanation of what it was, Erica and I, being the only sensible thinkers at the moment, and Bryce just barely waking up from us jumping in the car, decided we should investigate. Believing that it was probably just some kids in a nearby campsite trying to mess with us. We came to the top of the hill that was between our campsite and the next, and looked for any likely candidates for the scare. There were none. All we could see was a couple of trees and some bushes. We even called out, but there was no response. As we were walking back to the campsite, we heard noises, a rustling in the bushes behind us. We look again, but see nothing. At this point, we were considering that Lee and my wife may be right. We get back and it's getting dark fast, so I asked them, "Is there something we can do to keep them away for a little bit?" "Yes," said Lee. "They don't like fire." And him, my wife, and Bryce start working on a fire, while me and Erica go down by the lake to collect the 2 liters we had put in the water to keep cold. Now it's dark, and as Erica and I head back with the sodas, we hear rustling in the bushes beside us. We're both scared. We hurry back and put everything back in the car as quickly as possible, while Lee made sure the fire kept burning. After getting everything in the car, I rush over to the fire pit and tell everyone to get in the car as I proceed to stomp the fire out. Right as the fire went out, I hear a blood-curdling scream from across the lake. I felt my heart stop. Lee had said Skinwalkers are fast. They can make a full lap around this lake in a matter of seconds. I jump in the car and yell, "Go!" Right as the engine started and the lights come on, we see it coming out of the bushes in front of us. Glowing yellow eyes and what looked like a zombified coyote with decaying flesh. We backed up and peeled out of there as fast as we could. This happened 2 years ago, and it still scares me to know how close I came to death. I'm honestly amazed that we all survived such a close encounter with this thing. It was 1995. I had just graduated high school. An old friend who I haven't talked to in 7 years now and I were hanging out, and I said, "Let's go to New Orleans." So we did. We had $140 between us, and back then, that was more than enough. We made it to New Orleans, almost died from culture shock, and then turned around and headed to Magnolia, Mississippi to get some sleep. We stayed at Magnolia Inn. It was a crap hole, but it was nice and cool. It was May or June in South Mississippi. Cool was the only adjective that mattered. We stayed up that night playing poker, drinking Gordon's vodka, and talking about who knows what. Probably girls, college and college girls. At some point, I said, "Ever been to Texas?" "Nope." "Pack your bag and let's roll." We had a road atlas. Marshall, Texas was right across the border from Shreveport. We arrived in Shreveport, made a phone call to another friend, who we were actually supposed to be staying with. Both of our mothers had called looking for us. The only person that knew where we were was the buddy on the phone. It was no big deal. We'd be home in a day or two. I'm being short on details because if I don't, this will turn into a novel-length story about chasing armadillos and being chased by the boogeyman. Before we left that rest area in Shreveport where we made the call, we saw an armadillo. Let me tell you something about armadillos. Those bastards will hiss, jump, and turn into Tasmanian devils if you corner them. They also carry leprosy. We were 18. We chased that armadillo around for an hour. Now let me tell you about Shreveport. I don't know how it is now, but in the summer of '95, it looked and smelled like a place where oil and metal went to die. It was dirty. It was a crap hole. We crossed a bridge and saw people fishing about 100 yards from where a drainage pipe from a factory was spewing forth waste upriver from the fishermen. The locals reminded me of the locals in Adamsville. Bald-headed women and cross-eyed men. A lot of bald-headed, cross-eyed kids. I'm sorry, but it was a Rob Zombie movie come to life. I felt like I was going to be raped because I had a full head of hair and could see straight. The best part of Shreveport was an armadillo that might possibly have leprosy. Marshall, Texas was a good 40 miles away. We rolled on. Marshall was a decent little town, home of the Fire Ant Festival. We stopped at a little barbecue joint and had a Coke, a smile, and some pulled pork. It was getting late and the sun was setting. We looked at the map and decided to backtrack a bit and head up rural Route 43 through Karnak and past Caddo Lake. We'd eventually run into Highway 59, head to Texarkana, and then head back home. When we left the barbecue joint and headed towards 43, it was dusk. Highway 43 wasn't well lit. It was almost as dark as Natchez Trace Parkway. My friend was driving and we were doing about 45 miles per hour. Any faster would have been reckless, even for a couple 18-year-old dumbasses. This road was kind of like Christmasville Road. The locals reading this will know what I mean. The non-locals will just have to use your imagination. It was dark, winding, full of hills that ended in curves. There were beady and glowing eyes on both sides of the road. You could hear the crickets and the bullfrogs over the sound of the wind rushing by that old Sentra. It was peaceful and creepy at the same time. The humidity was a real thing, tangible. The air was thick. It smelled like pastures, hay, and swamp. We drove for what seemed like hours. It was after midnight, and I saw a sign that informed me that Bivens was the next town of any size. I was hypnotized by the yellow lines on the road. We hadn't seen another car in at least an hour. Sleepy, I rolled down the window and lit a cigarette. There was music coming from the radio, the tape player. It was either Tupac or Bob Seger. I smoked my cigarette, absent-mindedly flicking ashes out of the window. I took one last puff and flicked the Camel short off into the woods. Then I saw it. I never looked to my right. I didn't even kind of peek to the right. Maybe I did a little when I flicked the cigarette away. I don't know. What I do know is that in my periphery there was something running alongside the car. It was just behind my window, behind where the edge of the door ends, and before where the back window begins. I looked over at the speedometer, 40 miles per hour. I looked at my friend. He was looking straight ahead. I looked straight ahead, but I could still see it. I could see one huge arm, matted hair, reddish brown, sticky looking, primal. I eased my right hand over and rolled up my window. My friend was still looking straight ahead. His jaw was clenched, and he put both hands on the wheel and sped up. No words were said. I looked straight ahead, and still out of my periphery, I could see that arm moving. muscles and tendons visibly rippling beneath that matted hair. As the car gained a little speed, the thing running alongside us lost pace slightly. I then saw the hand on the end of that nightmarish arm. The hand was clenched into a fist the size of a cantaloupe, a big cantaloupe. It was covered in the same hair, but slightly darker around the fingers, like it was stained with something. Suddenly, the hand unclenched, and then I saw the claws. Black as this damned after midnight Texas night. Those claws were at least 2 inches long, sharp, like an animal's. This wasn't a hand so much as it was the killing paw and claws of some beast whose only purpose was to kill and eat. I looked back at my friend. I looked at the speedometer, 50 miles per hour. I looked straight ahead. It was still there. I lit another cigarette, didn't roll the window down, and simply said, "Shit." The music had stopped. I finally broke the silence and said, "Hey, do you?" And before I could finish, my buddy said, "I see it. I've been seeing it. I can't even see you, but I can see whatever the hell that thing is." "How much do you see?" "More than I want to." "Speed up, John. Just speed up. It can't keep up forever." I looked over. 55 miles per hour. Whatever was chasing us silently was starting to lag behind. I finally looked to my right, just a bit. Imagine the scary part of the movie where you put your hands in front of your face but still peek through. In 37 years, I have 2 regrets. One is picking up that first cigarette, and the other is me looking to my right that night. This beast was huge. Its chest was above the top of the car, and all I could see was that matted reddish-brown hair. Then it bent forward as it ran, and I saw the face of this thing. All reality stopped. We were no longer driving down some country road in Texas. We were now trying to escape from the depths of a monster-inhabited hell. This thing's face is beyond my powers to describe. It was evil. The eyes were black and the pupils were red. It flashed its teeth at me in a snarl, yellow and huge. Saliva dripped from its mouth. It opened its eyes wide and it looked hungry and mad. Then it opened its mouth. The skin pulled back until all I could see were black gums and yellow teeth. Immediately, I could feel the car accelerate. "Go, John, just go!" I prayed. I cussed. I lit a cigarette. Then, like sunshine breaking through the clouds, the road straightened out. "Don't you slow down." We drove through Bivens, and we drove to Texarkana. Then we drove home. We never said a word. It was years later, 11 to be exact, before we ever even talked about it again, and even then, we didn't talk about it much. He said he'd never told anyone, and I hadn't either. I told the story a few years back for the first time, while I was parked out on a gravel road, doing the things you do when you're parked out on a gravel road with a good-looking woman. I told it a year or so ago to a couple of kids who wanted to hear a scary story while they sat around a campfire. They didn't sleep for a day or two, but they asked me a dozen more times to tell them the story. I never told anyone until now that I saw its face. I've been scared for my life exactly 2 times. Once was on that road, and once was looking at a grizzly bear in front of me with a terminal velocity, inducing drop to the side of me. Call it what you will. Call it bullshit if you want, but look me in the eyes then let me tell you this story, and you'll know. Never doubt that there are things in this world that defy explanation and logic. The boogeyman is real. Yesterday, me and my 3 brothers went on a short one-night camping trip to the lava tubes near Fillmore, Utah. It was pretty much in the middle of nowhere in the desert. We had a good evening hanging out and talking before watching the stars, a movie, and going to bed. We brought a 4-man tent and set up our campsite far from the dirt road, even though we were the only people there. My brothers all fell asleep pretty fast, though for some reason I couldn't. So I just listened to the coyotes howling in the distance for about an hour and a half. By now it's about 12:30 or 1 a.m. and I'm still awake. Suddenly, I get this odd feeling, like the hairs on the back of my neck stood up and my gut sank at the same time. That's when I hear it. Someone or something was walking toward our campsite. At first, I thought it was just a coyote, but it sounded heavy, and its footsteps sounded like it was bipedal. I could hear its feet sliding through the grass and shifting the stones on the ground as it was getting closer and closer to us, until the footsteps sounded like it was right beside our tent. But I couldn't see it from where I was. Suddenly, I heard a shrill, hollow, unearthly whistle coming from just outside the tent. I went stiff. My heart was racing. It sounded so unnatural and alien that I didn't know how to react. I was just terrified. Finally, after a long minute of silence, I heard it slowly walk away, the same heavy footsteps, until I couldn't hear it anymore. I was more scared than I've ever been in my life last night. I was too scared to even peek outside the tent, but now I kind of wish I had. I stayed awake for another hour, wondering if I should wake my brothers or not. But I decided against it and tried to sleep. This morning, before we packed up and left, I told them what I had heard, but none of them believed me until we made it back home and my dad told us something really unsettling. He said that last night, around 12:30, he felt super worried about us and he didn't know why. He told us that he had this feeling like we were in severe danger and that he needed to pray for our protection, which he did immediately. Once my brothers heard him say that, they took my story a little more seriously, but they're still skeptical, as am I. I don't know what I heard last night, but I do know that I heard something. My name is Eli, and I'm 22 years old now. I've always loved being outdoors and in the woods. I remember about 9 years ago, when I was around 12 or 13. My family and I moved to Minnesota to help out my grandparents. They were getting up there in age and couldn't run the farm like they used to, and also just for a change of scenery. A year or so after the move, my 2 brothers and I got into the habit of running around the edge of the woods, along the backsides of the property, and exploring where we probably shouldn't. One day after school, my brothers and I got our stuff and made about a 500-yard walk to the forest behind the house. My brothers decided to take off and run ahead, about another 300 yards ahead of me. They were wrestling and just being rambunctious teens. I noticed a bundle of flowers that my grandmother would have loved. As I was looking at the flowers, I heard a bit of rustling in the woods, about 15 or 20 feet to my right. I didn't think much about it, because, it's the woods, so I shook my head and went to grab the bunch of flowers to give to my grandmother. No sooner than I reached my hand out to grab them, I heard, in my brother's voice, someone call my name for help. It sounded just like my little brother, except it was off a little bit, like it was being played by a recording. I immediately froze because, as I looked up, I noticed my two brothers were a ways ahead of me, playing in the snow. I remember calling for them to hurry up and come with me to the house. And as I turned to run up to the house, I noticed a lone coyote moving in between some old beat-up trucks that my grandfather had parked in a pasture on the edge of the woods. But this coyote was considerably larger than anyone I've seen up until this point. But what struck me as odd was that this coyote looked like it had been hit by a car, and I swear, as it moved around, it looked like it had its paws on the side of the truck, like it was trying to look over the truck at me. I couldn't help myself and yelled, "Hey!" to it, and we sat for about a minute or so, just staring at each other. Before I could turn and start walking back to my house, I watched this thing lean around the truck and say in my brother's voice again, "Hey!" When this happened, I yelled for my brothers and booked it to the porch of the house. As my brothers caught up to me, they noticed how pale I was and asked what was wrong. So I told them I'd seen a mountain lion, scared of being ridiculed for seeing something so ridiculously frightening. Later that night, I was looking around on the internet and found some other encounters by people all over the United States. They'd had similar stories, and I came across an article about skinwalkers, which was both terrifying and interesting. This isn't the only encounter I've had with such entities. I just wanted to get my story out there as a bit of a warning that there are things out there that don't really make sense to the human mind. This is part 2 of my story. My name is Eli. I'm 22 years old, and I'm still a pretty avid outdoorsman, despite the events that have plagued me in the past. The events in this encounter happened not too far outside Ocala National Forest in Central Florida. So the day started with a phone call from my brother, who was asking to take a hike in the National Forest outside of our town, and then to spend the night out there in hopes of doing a little fishing and roasting some marshmallows over a fire. It was me, my brother, and his girlfriend, so it was going to just be a chill night. We left town and headed to the woods pretty early that day, around 3 in the afternoon. We'd gotten to our spot in the woods after 2 hours of riding around, trying to find the perfect spot to set a tent. My brother, sister, and I decided to start the day with some fishing, so we grabbed our rods and a tackle box and headed for a little stream about a quarter mile from our camping spot. As we came close to the stream, we noticed an awful smell, like rotten meat. When we came up to the river, we found the source of the smell, an abundance of dead fish all around the edge of the stream, and we saw that the water had a nasty rust-colored tint to it. When we were done gagging at the sight and smell of what was in front of us, a huge sense of dread washed over us, with an uncomfortable feeling of being watched. My sister noticed and asked what was wrong, so I played it off with a joke and suggested we go make the fire and set up the tent, not wanting to frighten her. After another 30-minute hike from the stream back to the campground, my brother and sister started collecting wood for the fire, while I started to set up the tent. I finished around the same time they came back, so we got the fire lit and decided to start roasting some marshmallows. Before I could eat any, I had to pee, so I told them I was going to step into the woods for a second. I walked about 30 feet into the woods and started to relieve myself, when suddenly I heard my sister say, "Hello." Finding this extremely odd, I looked around and didn't see anyone or anything, so I went back to my business. As I was zipping up my zipper, I heard her say again, "Hey." Thinking they were pranking me, I rushed back to the campground to find them still roasting marshmallows over the fire. Kind of freaked out, I asked them if they had been messing with me, to which they frowned and explained that they'd been in the same spot since I went into the woods. Now terrified, they saw how ghost white I turned and asked me if everything was all right. I told them what I'd heard, and they suggested we just go into the tent and go to bed early, so that's what we did. After already taking a while to fall asleep, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of underbrush crunching right outside of our tent. The horrible smell from earlier also returned, worse than before. For fear of scaring the hell out of my brother and sister, I decided not to wake them up. I just sat there, shaking and sweating. I noticed the sound of twigs snapping had stopped, and I began to hear loud, raspy, and heavy breathing, like something was trying to sniff out our tent. I quietly tried to lay back down and cover my ears so I couldn't hear the breathing anymore, and eventually I fell back asleep. The next morning, we woke up late, so we decided to start packing up our belongings and head home. When we got out of the tent, the first thing we noticed was that our cooler had been torn up and thrown upside down against a tree, with everything that was in it strewn throughout the campsite. Another thing I noticed when I was rolling up the tent was there were a ton of footprints. Weird footprints that almost looked like normal, except for obvious claw marks above each toe. Once I spotted these, I hurried up with putting the tent in my truck and got my brother, sister, and myself out of there as quickly as I could. As of yet, I haven't been back camping in any kind of woods, and I can't imagine coming across another one of these things. A few years ago, the girl I was dating at the time invited me to go with her family to their grandmother's house for Christmas. This being the first time I've ever been to a Native American reservation, I wasn't sure what to expect. I had a lot of ideas regarding what it might be like, as well as the what-ifs. Nevertheless, excited to go somewhere I'd never been before, I agreed. Most of my excitement was reserved towards learning more about the culture and the unique opportunity of visiting a reservation as an outsider. Because of this, I was also a bit nervous. What if I wasn't accepted? Would the people be welcoming, or would they be hostile towards my presence? Although these questions were lingering, most of my fears were quelled by the wonderful hospitality I was shown by both her grandmother and the people I had the privilege to interact with while visiting. We left our house on Christmas Eve with our dog and began the 4-hour journey to Grandma's house. On the way, we saw the most beautiful sunset over the mountains. After traveling for about 3 hours, we found ourselves at the turnoff that led to an hour-long drive on a desolate road that would eventually take us to our destination. While on this road, my significant other shared stories of dances and the polytheistic practices their tribe had. All of this fascinated me and left me asking even more questions. By the time we arrived at her grandma's house, it was dark and cold out. I began unpacking the car while my significant other took our dog a bit away from the house to do his business. By the time they got back, I had taken our bags inside and locked the car up for the night. As we sat around the table eating, we shared stories and played a card game. After about an hour, we all said goodnight to one another and got ready to turn in for bed. At midnight, my girlfriend and I laid down and called our dog to the bed. A short time thereafter, we fell asleep. I had forgotten to turn the light off that was next to the bed on the nightstand. At around 2 or 3 a.m., I woke up, having to use the restroom, and noticed that our dog was sitting, just looking at the door that led out to the small hallway. On the other side was the main door to the house. I called for him to come back to bed, and he just put his nose at the base of the bedroom door, sniffing while scratching. Thinking he too had to use the restroom, I walked up to the main house door and opened it, ushering him to go do his business. He ended up just sitting there and staring. After trying to coax him to go outside a few times and failing, I closed the door and made my way to the kitchen to grab a glass of water. In the kitchen, there was a big window to the right of the sink, overlooking the driveway to the house, with a bit of light that makes the driveway just barely visible at night. As I reached to turn on the faucet, my head turned to the right to look outside, and I could see a dog sitting outside, staring into the house. Something was off about this dog, though. It was much larger than a typical large breed by 2 times. I began to get the chills and internally said to myself, "Screw this." Grabbing my water and about to head back to bed, the dog got up and began to walk away. It's hard to explain, but the way the dog walked was off. It seemed to walk very awkwardly and stiff. After making my way back to bed, I eventually managed to fall asleep. The next morning at breakfast, I nonchalantly asked if the neighbors had an extra large dog. That's when Grandma began to ask questions, and my girlfriend started to look concerned. Her grandma immediately made a few phone calls, and after a bit of time passed, a native priest and healer arrived at the house, and they began conversing silently with Grandma. Thinking I must have done something wrong, my girlfriend joined them in their conversation. They all began to look at me and talk more, and then the priest went around the house with sage and cedar. The healer came to talk with me about my experience, and my girlfriend disappeared outside the house, apparently to gather raw meat. From what I understand, I encountered something I shouldn't have the previous night, and by my arrival, they had to make certain preparations to ensure our safety for the duration of my stay. After this visit, we visited many other times, and I didn't have any other weird experiences, but it left me chilled to the bone and will stay with me for the rest of my life. I can't get over how this dog behaved and how huge it was. Around a year ago, in May of 2020, my parents were going on their annual trip to Florida with my 3 brothers for the week. My mother asked me if I could go by their house and feed the family dogs or stay and house sit. Being the daughter I am, I told my mother I'd just stay at their house to save on gas. Throughout the week at night, I'd bring the 2 dogs inside to feel safer, since my parents live on somewhat of a back road. Keep in mind, my parents' house is surrounded by trees, and there's a thick tree line separating their house from the 2 neighbors. Well, one night while I was at the house alone, I called my best friend Bailey to come over and stay the night. We were going to do what 2 middle-aged 20-year-old females do when alone. Play video games, watch movies, TikToks, and drink a little. While Bailey and I were in the kitchen, around 3 or 4 a.m. making homemade funnel cakes, the dogs kept moving around and staring at the glass kitchen door that led off into the back porch. I asked Bailey to let them out so they could chill and we'd have enough leg room while we were cooking. While we were eating our funnel cakes, we came across a TikTok about making homemade temporary tattoos with a printed picture and perfume. Now, keep in mind, my parents have almost 4 acres of land, so there's the family house, my father's 2-door garage workshop, and a large barn. Those 2 buildings are farther out near the tree line, so Bailey and I walked down to the workshop to go into my parents' work office. I punched in the code to the garage door, and we went inside straight to the computer and printed each other out a picture of Kylo Ren to try and make into temporary tattoos for each other. Before I go any further, a little side note. My parents have security cameras all around their property, and inside the office is a television above the desk showing all of the live footage from the cameras. So while I was cutting out the tattoo for Bailey, she says, "What is that?" I stop cutting and look up at the cameras. At first, I didn't see anything except for a small figure in front of the pole barn. It looked like it was sniffing at the garage door. I shrugged it off and told her it was probably one of the many stray dogs that roamed around the area. Bailey nudged my arm quickly after I said that and pointed to the screen again. Wanting to prove to her it was just a stray dog, I stood up and looked closer at the screen. When I did, I saw the figure, but it didn't look like one of the small dogs. The creature was hunched over on all 4s. Its arms were super thin and long, but pointing outwards from its chest. Kind of like how you'd imagine the girl from The Exorcism to be when she crawled on all 4s. It had no fur. Its skin looked tight on its body. I don't know what the hell I was thinking, but I went to open the door to look at it. But thankfully, Bailey stopped me right when I grabbed the lock. Looking back at the screen at the creature, it looked like it scratched at the door of the pole barn I immediately said, "What the hell is that?" And the creature turned its head straight at the camera. When its head turned, I couldn't make out clear facial features, but it looked like it had a human head with two big glowing eyes. Bailey and I screamed, and it bolted, and I mean bolted, off screen. Clearly freaked out, Bailey and I hugged each other as if that would protect us. Then something smashed against the garage door, not once, but twice. Like, you know what it sounds like when someone smacks the garage door from the outside with their hand? That's what it sounded like. I called my grandmother and told her we thought we saw something and to stay on the phone with us until we ran into the house. Once we got into the house, we brought the dogs in and locked every single door. Eventually, we were able to fall asleep. Now, we've talked about this a few times, and I think it was a Wendigo, but Bailey thinks it was a Skinwalker. Either way, I know I'll never go out to that building alone at night, ever again. My story starts with coming back from the store with my family. In my village, an entire new neighborhood was being built. Mind you, I live in an area that used to have a lot of forest around me, which has since been destroyed due to people building houses. There was a dirt road in the middle of the woods from the main road that led to a shortcut to my house. I was maybe 9 or 10 at the time, and I distinctly remember sitting in the middle seat in the middle row of our family minivan, so I had a clear view in between the driver's seat and passenger seat. I was talking with my younger siblings, goofing off, and I looked up to see it crouched on the road. It looked almost exactly like the picture you get when you Google the rake. It had pale gray skin. It was freakishly slender, and it had eyes like reflectors. I freaked out and screamed, saying something along the lines of, "What is that?" And both of my parents turned around, asking what I was talking about. I burst into tears and saw it run over behind a tree. It was so tall. I saw it peek from the tree a couple of times and explained what it looked like to my mom while hysterical. My mom didn't believe me at all and got mad at me for trying to scare my siblings. Around that time, I used to watch a lot of those ghosts caught on tape type stuff on YouTube, and I'd show my younger siblings, which resulted in many nightmares for them. My dad, on the other hand, said it was probably just a deer. It looked nothing like a deer. I still remember the eyes. When we passed by the tree I saw it run behind, nothing was there. It was completely dark. I thought I must have imagined it, until my dad told me he saw something too when we got home. He told me he had seen something out of the corner of his eye, but didn't get a good look since I started screaming and he had turned around to look at me. To this day, it still scares me, and I never walk too close to the woods at night. I grew up in the town of Shiprock, New Mexico. My grandfather was a tribal medicine man. I'd been off at a boarding school a few towns over at this time, but visited my family's modest desert home every weekend. It was during one of those visits that one evening I heard the dogs relentlessly barking outside at something. After a few moments of this, something made a thud on the roof of the house, as if something very large had jumped up there. As my sisters cowered under the covers, I went to go wake my parents. They told me it was just a cat and that I should go back to bed. I did, but soon I could hear it thumping about on the roof over my room, and I could even make out the scratching of claws and heavy breathing. The dogs were barking and running around the house as it walked back and forth, and at once, it stopped. Everything was quiet. Suddenly, I heard one of the dogs whimper, as if it had been hurt. Then the footsteps started up again. I could tell it wasn't a dog or cat. It was a human, someone heavy, walking on 2 legs. I fell asleep as I was listening. The next morning, I checked the area. There were weird footprints. I tried to tell my parents, but they just brushed it off. No one paid attention. The prints weren't very clear because the ground was too hard. Since no one was listening, I just dropped it. Within 4 days, my cousin passed away. She was only 25 years old. She lived on the north side of the house. Before she passed on Sunday afternoon, she had mentioned a bad headache. That was the last time I heard her talking about the pain. After she passed on, my family brought in a medicine man, and he conducted a ceremony. He said, "2 of you know about it." Everyone looked at me and my sister. We had never told our story to anyone. He said, "It's a man in a bearskin," and I saw he was on the roof of the house. When he walked on the roof, he was using a white powder, and he blew it over her. He walked round and round and round, and blew it on everyone to put you all in a deep sleep. He had a helper. It was a hummingbird. He blew this white powder on her, and that's how she passed away. Then he explained, "I see lights. The light traveling toward your house. It was like a bright flashlight, not a spotlight." The medicine man said, "That is it. It is that light." He conducted the prayers and chanted songs. He prayed using sacred words I'd never heard. He took out fire ashes and arrowheads to ward off the Skinwalker. After singing and praying for several hours, the light suddenly disappeared. At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant by white powder. But later my grandma told me that white powder is crushed human bone, which they get from the graveyard. One night, my brothers and I were home alone when our dogs began making a ruckus outside. We tried to ignore it, thinking the dogs had just gotten riled up by coyotes or some other wild animal, but they wouldn't stop barking. Finally, we managed to get to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night having to use the bathroom, which meant I had to go to the outhouse outside. My brother joined me. We picked up some flashlights and headed out into the night. The dogs suddenly began barking again, and I shined my flashlight out into the darkness. All of a sudden, there was a very loud whine from one of the dogs. Then everything went quiet again. It was really too quiet for that time of year. Not even the sheep were making noise. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a few of the dogs going completely mad by the truck. When I looked over, there was this man. He was unbelievably tall, leaning one arm on the cab roof of the truck. He was looking at the dogs for a little, and then suddenly he kicked one of them. They all scattered in different directions. This thing looked up at me, and I saw its face. It had a pure white face, like a full moon, 2 burning red eyes, and a slight smile that was pure black. I couldn't move or make a sound. It began walking toward me with long strides until it finally towered over me. All I could see was a dark red, like the color of the blood when you cut the throat of a sheep. I kept getting deeper and deeper into its eyes. I could faintly hear my brother coming out of the outhouse. With this, the thing looked up at him. Reality came rushing back to me. I noticed that my brother was too distracted with his buckle to realize what was going on. I also noticed this thing's long hands hovering just inches from my head. Its skin was black ash, and it smelled like a bloated dead animal in summer. I was still unable to move or speak. The Skinwalker began to move toward my brother. Finally, noticing this figure, my brother became as paralyzed as I was. The thing drew closer and closer, reaching an arm out toward my brother's head. Something finally snapped in me. I became unbearably angry. I broke from the trance and lunged at the Skinwalker, raising my arms like a wild animal and baring my teeth at it. A growl came out that I never knew I could make. I became more and more angry at this thing for trying to hurt us. It kept that smile at first, but the angrier I got, the more the smile faded. Finally, with everything I had, I began to make this primal roar at it. It fell backwards and ran away into the night. Looking back at me, its eyes were dim and dull, its smile now long since gone. The next morning, my family returned home from the feast. After relaying the story to my parents, they quickly hired a medicine man. My family and I live in a rural community on the Navajo reservation. My aunt and her two brothers were home alone, while my grandparents had left for the evening to attend a chapter house meeting. They were in the house, and like many people from the reservation, they didn't have electricity. It had been dark outside for about an hour, and my aunt and uncles were getting ready for bed. Outside, they began to hear noises, as if someone was moving things around. My oldest uncle went to look out the front window and saw a figure out by the truck. This was immensely out of the ordinary because the closest neighbor was miles away. Whatever it was, it opened the truck door and began to dig through the personal items my family had left in the vehicle. My aunt and uncles were frightened by the sight and knew they should take action. They took out a rifle and all steadied themselves to hold it up. They flung open the door and aimed the gun at the dark figure. The figure turned and started to walk towards them, totally unfazed by the weapon. My uncle pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The figure drew closer, and my aunt began to smell something like a rotting corpse. It was so strong it made her gag. My uncle continued to pull the trigger with no luck, and the figure came closer and closer. Off in the distance, headlights were coming up the road. My grandparents were returning. The figure looked toward the lights and started to move away, and tucked itself behind a tree near the house. My oldest uncle ran toward the truck with the gun. My grandfather got out of the car, and my uncle pointed to the tree. The thing was poking its head out to observe what they were doing. My grandfather ran into the house and went over to the stove and grabbed a handful of ashes. He rubbed them over the gun and placed an ash-covered bullet into the chamber. He walked out onto the porch and fired toward the tree. Whatever that thing was, it didn't expect the gun to go off. The gunshot echoed, and the dark figure began running. My grandma and aunt ran inside, and my uncles and grandfather chased after it. There weren't many roads or paths, so as they chased after the figure, the truck was bouncing, and the headlights weren't fixed on one particular spot. My uncle swears that whenever the headlights would hit the figure, he saw a woman. Not only that, whoever it was, they were running on all fours, like a bear. My grandfather eventually stopped the truck, and as they neared the ditch that drops about 20 feet, he got out and began to yell in Navajo. My uncle says that he was yelling about a local woman. He yelled that he wasn't scared and that he knew it was her, and to leave his family alone. A few days passed, and there was news that the woman that my grandfather was yelling about had passed. I've always been told that if you know who a Skinwalker is, say their name, and it'll kill them. This took place in 1993, when I was a security guard at a small hotel in Taos, New Mexico. On this particular evening, I'd been working the graveyard shift, patrolling in my car around the hotel grounds, and I decided to park and take a nap. It was after midnight, close to 2 a.m., and I was in my car. I parked under a tree, and I guess I semi-drifted off. Suddenly, something struck the bottom of my car with enough force to make it sway. This car was a rather heavy 1978 Thunderbird. I started the car and pulled forward, turning around in the lot. Sitting where I'd been parked was a dog-like thing with an odd face staring me down. I felt a dark energy about it, like it was invading my soul. It had human features, especially the eyes. They had that spark of human, but they were wholly evil. Its face didn't have a long snout. It looked like a human nose, a bit extended, but not black-tipped like a dog. As for size and body, it was a bit bigger than an adult German Shepherd. Its fur was rather mangy and dirty-looking black and tan. It was thickly muscled. Looking at this thing gave me that feeling of fear instinctively, when you know you're in big danger. I hit the gas and tried to hit it with my car. It ran off the property onto native land across the road. It then ran back across onto the hotel property. I chased after it, and it ran into a third parking lot. It then ran into an area called the ponds, where the weeds grow about 8 to 9 feet tall. There were 2 large cesspools there, and the area was really weed-filled. I parked and grabbed my pistol and ran on foot after it. I could hear it moving through the weeds. It was circling, trying to come up from behind me. Then it rushed and threw me aside like I was built of matchsticks. I felt around and found my pistol, and again chased after it. Though it ran in on 4 legs, it ran back out on 2. It looked like a shambling, nude, man-like thing, and it screamed as it fled. The scream was both human and animal. It was horrifying. The thing ran across an area that had sagebrush and cactus, in the direction of some houses, so I couldn't risk a shot at it. The native housekeeping crew at the hotel told me that I had certainly met up with a Skinwalker. I was also plagued by bad luck, nightmares, and health problems after this, possibly related to the encounter. It got to the point where I actually sought out a native shaman to cleanse me with a ritual and sacred smoke. As to why the Skinwalker came for me in the first place, I believe it had been stalking me for weeks, or even months, for reasons unknown. The shaman gave me a spirit protector in the form of a white wolf, which has managed to break the spell of the Skinwalker, dispelling the nightmares and allowing my health to stabilize. My father owns a small delivery service that operates out of Farmington, New Mexico. We mostly deliver small packages out to the middle of nowhere that are too much of a hassle for larger delivery companies to bother with. My dad is the only employee, and we have a few pickup trucks and a trailer. One day we got a delivery out to Window Rock, Arizona, on the Navajo reservation about 2 hours from Farmington. My dad got the call for the job while he was chilling with his Navajo friend, Travis, and his girlfriend. Travis mentioned how he had family in Window Rock that he hadn't seen in ages and suggested that we go with him. I was about 6 or 7 at the time, and it was summertime, so my dad decided we'd go down together. He could do his delivery really quickly, then while Travis saw his family, we could go check out the Window Rock, a big rock face with a large hole in it that went to the other side. We had to convoy in separate trucks since my dad's was loaded down with freight. We decided to bring along some walkie-talkies so we could communicate with one another. We spent our time in Window Rock. Everything was generally uneventful, and we started heading back home along the old highway with my dad and I in the front, and Travis and his girlfriend in their truck behind us. I honestly don't remember most of the Window Rock trip, but this next part I can never forget. We were somewhere on the highway between Window Rock and Gallup, New Mexico. It had just rained earlier in the day and the road was kind of slick, so we were taking it pretty slowly. On the left of the highway there was nothing but sandstone cliffs, and on the right there was a huge field separated from the road by a small barbed wire fence. We crested the top of the hill, and down at the bottom of the hill we saw what appeared to be a very large dog, sitting back on its haunches in the middle of the road, facing the cliffs. My dad called over the radio, "Hey Trav, do you see that huge dog?" Travis started yelling back over the radio, "That's not a dog. Speed up right now and hit it." He sounded almost hysterical. He just kept screaming, "You have to hit it. Please. Hit that thing right now." So my dad started to speed up, and as we got a bit closer, I could begin to see it a little more clearly. It's covered in this brown, wiry, matted hair that appeared to have dried blood all over it. It was still facing the cliffs, but the moment our headlights hit it, it turned and looked at us, and it had a face. Look, I don't know how else to describe it other than a mix between a bear's and a human's face. It looked twisted and distorted and almost in pain. As we got closer to this thing, we started to realize how big it actually was. Though it was still sitting on its haunches, it was about shoulder height with the hood of the truck. We got literally inches from hitting it when it let out this scream. It sounded like someone screaming as their lungs were filling with water, and it leapt backwards towards the field, landing just on our side of the barbed wire fence. Then, with another leap, it was gone from sight. Travis came over the radio again. "Keep driving. We have to get out of here. We have to go faster." He kept repeating that last part. Pretty soon we were speeding like crazy, and just as we started to come near the outskirts of Gallup, we got pulled over. Travis pulled his truck over with us. Naturally, this made the cop, a Navajo man himself, very on edge, and he immediately asked why Travis felt the need to pull over as well. Travis said, "We just saw a Skinwalker a few miles back and it's been following us." The officer immediately turned white, stammered something about a verbal warning, and got in his car and took off. We did the same. We didn't see anything else that night, but when we got home, Travis refused to let us leave without taking some kind of Navajo totem thing that was supposed to keep it away. Anybody that has been on the Navajo reservation has either probably heard of some creepy things or experienced them themselves, namely skinwalkers. I've only seen one. Here is my story. I come from a small town in northern Arizona that's sandwiched between the Paiute Reservation to the north and the U.S.'s largest Navajo reservation to the south. My high school being so small, a 1A high school that has, on average, 80 students enrolled every year, we always had to travel south about 5 to 10 hours one way to play another high school in any sport. This means that we traveled a lot on the Navajo res. And we also usually stayed at hotels when we would head out to play and come home in the morning, but this trip was a little bit different. I remember the basketball coach saying that the school didn't have enough money to put up the teams in a hotel, so we were going to have to be on the road for a total of about 12 hours. I was the only male senior to play basketball that season. We had just got done playing our game and headed home on our bus, Big Blue. We were headed out, and it wasn't long, about 2 hours of driving before we had entered the res. By this time, everyone was asleep, with it being about 2 in the morning. When we had crossed the res's border, I noticed the bus driver had sped up and was now going about 85 miles per hour. I thought this was a little weird because he usually never exceeded the speed limit, at least not in my high school career. For some reason, I couldn't fall asleep like the rest of my teammates, and I just sat at the back of the bus staring out across the desolate desert landscape lit up by the full moon. As I looked down, I could see a figure running towards the bus at an angle of pursuit and keeping up with the bus at 85 miles per hour. As the figure got closer, I saw that it was a humanoid form. As a matter of fact, it looked exactly like a human, except that the face was painted half black and half white with glowing eyes. Glowing eyes like a rabbit's eyes reflecting light from a spotlight. I immediately thought, holy crap, it's a Skinwalker. The Skinwalker ran up to the edge of the road and just kept up pace with the bus, hurtling sagebrush and rocks while staring at me. After I made eye contact with the thing, I could not look away. It was as if something was holding my head and eyes in place. The Skinwalker just smiled at me, this inhuman smile that went ear to ear, showing a mouthful of crooked, yellow, pointed teeth. I felt like I was going to throw up, and I was panicking through the whole ordeal. The Skinwalker started to crumple down onto all fours, still keeping up with the bus. I could see its bones crack and reform. Hair started appearing all over the Skinwalker's body, and in about 3 seconds, it was now a coyote, and it ran off back into the desert, out of view. As soon as it was gone, I ran to the onboard bathroom and puked a mixture of food and blood. I didn't want to tell anyone for fear they would think I was crazy, but I confided in my Navajo friend. She told me that I needed to see the chief, who also happened to be a friend of mine, and get a blessing. I saw him the next school day in the parking lot. He just came up to me and mumbled something in Navajo while waving a feathered scepter-like thing. He turned around, got in his truck, and drove away. To this day, I haven't seen another Skinwalker. It might be due to the fact that I moved away from the town in res, and if I do have to go south, I go around, way around. As many of you might already know, many Navajo people, including my own family, are very reluctant to speak about Skinwalkers because it's believed to attract their attention. Well, I, however, grew up away from the Navajo Nation and was very naive about the subject. When it came to Skinwalkers, I was an absolute skeptic. My mom used to tell a story of how, back in the 80s, when she lived with her siblings and my grandparents, still in Shiprock but the southern outskirts, about how she and my aunt saw a Skinwalker just outside their driveway under a streetlight. She described it as a black dog with dirty fur, a twisted noodle-like front leg, and these unnatural eyes with a soft, burnt orange glow. Me, being my own closed-minded self, doubted every word, but I never said my doubts aloud. But these doubts totally changed last year when I went to my grandparents' house in October. Me and my family had just left the carnival at the Navajo Nation Fair and called it a night. The house was close enough to where we could walk home in just 10 minutes, so we did. When we got there, it was about 9 at night, and we stayed up until 2, catching up about family affairs and local news. It was during that time that I just decidedly opened my mouth and blurted out the question, "Hey, are Skinwalkers real, guys?" I asked. "You shouldn't be speaking about that," my grandma said with an almost disturbed yell in her voice. So she and my grandfather both decided to go to bed. After being scolded by my mom, one of my aunts chimed in with a very cautious tone and said, "They're real, all right." Had a few start screaming outside of my trailer in Farmington just a few nights ago. Your cousin had nightmares the whole night and woke up crying that morning. Not wanting to push the discomfort any farther, we all decided to go to bed. Now the trailer/home is pretty old, and it was a really nice night, so we slept with the windows open with screens to prevent bugs from coming in. Everyone had drifted off to sleep except me, because my mind was still going a million miles a minute about skinwalkers, and I wondered if I'd ever encounter one while here on the reservation. As a kid, I was told it's taboo to think about skinwalkers because it can still call their attention. That's when things went totally haywire. Just as I was settling and finally getting relaxed for sleep, I started to hear something moving outside. I got up from the couch and started wandering over to the kitchen window. In the trailer, all of the rooms have the lights out, so the only visible light that can be seen is from the porch light out front. I was thankful for this because I told myself if it really was a skinwalker outside, then hopefully it wouldn't notice me seeing it. So I mustered up the courage and took a quick scan of outside. From the porch light, all I could see was the dusty ground and the vehicles that my family drove, along with some old metal trash cans that stood beside the road. Looking for about a good 5 seconds, I wasn't able to see anything, so I was getting ready to turn around and walk back to bed. I was thinking it was just a stray cat or something. I had only taken 2 steps, and I heard what sounded like a distorted scream coming from outside, definitely close by. Fear rising, I looked outside again, and there I saw it. A coyote-like figure was staring in my direction from behind the cars, just outside of the reach of the porch light. Only it looked awfully wrong and gave off an evil vibe just from seeing it. It was gray with very disheveled hair, and a horrific orange-red soft glow came from its eyes. I hopped out and ran back to the bedroom. It was at this moment I began to notice an awful stench in the air that smelled like rotting meat. I started trying to wake up my mom, who was like, "Oh my God, it's almost 3 a.m., what do you want?" I immediately began in a shaken voice, "There's something scary outside." Then she said, being annoyed because I woke her up, "It's probably just a stray animal or something. It's the res, animals wander all the time at night." She clearly wasn't taking me seriously, so I told her, "Mom, please, I really need you." That got her attention. "What are you talking about?" she said. Then we heard it. The thing outside started making more of its dreadful screams and started what sounded like thrashing outside on the ground. "Hear that? That's what I'm talking about." So both her and I got back up and looked outside the window, and the coyote thing was making its way to the door. It walked with an odd limp and dragged its back right leg as if it was handicapped. We could hear it start to scratch against the door and make this odd, muffled moaning sound. My mom went and got my dad, and they both started shouting in Navajo all sorts of words, telling the thing to go away and saying it's not welcome here. All this commotion was enough to get the rest of the trailer up as they came out into the hallway. The only thing my mom did was turn to them and said, "Skinwalker," while proceeding to point to the door. Apparently, they already knew exactly what to do as my grandfather got out a handgun from a drawer and a bag of ashes. He coated a few bullets and loaded them into the gun and went straight to the door. Yelling out more Navajo that was far too fast for me to comprehend, he swung the door open and fired twice. Nothing. The thing managed to escape before my grandpa could put a bullet in it. "That's the fastest one I've ever seen," said my grandpa. Next thing you know, my aunts and my parents were freaking out about what just happened, saying stuff like, "What if it comes back tomorrow?" And, "It saw us, does that mean we're targets now?" Afterwards, my grandparents calmed everyone down, myself included, saying we'd be fine, and we all went to bed around 3. Morning came, and my grandparents called one of their neighbors and explained to them what had happened. Apparently, one of them was a medicine man who used to partake in Navajo ceremonies used for healing and curing sickness, and came over to bless each family member in the grounds outside. Throughout my childhood, my father and I used to take late-night walks due to his insomnia. Our neighborhood was generally considered very safe, but now I'm not so sure. All of these walks were very dear memories of mine, except one, which ended up being the last one. Along the road with the tree line, there was a single street light to illuminate a small plot of land that someone owned, but it was very overgrown and ill-kept. It was common for us to walk this road to enjoy the sounds of the forest, the lack of illumination, and the ease of circling back. One ordinary night, as we were walking and making conversation, my father abruptly stopped, pulled me close, put his finger over my mouth, and pointed towards the single illuminated plot roughly 100 yards away. At first, I didn't see anything and thought he was pulling my leg, but just as I began to protest his grasp, I saw a very small humanoid figure, roughly 3 feet in height, scrawny with long limbs, materialize out of the brush line and cautiously take in its surroundings before signaling towards the brush. After a few seconds, 2 other small humanoid figures materialized as well. After a brief moment of what looked to be a discussion, all 3 made a dash for the forest line. Once this happened, my father picked me up, threw me over his shoulder, and made a break for our home, which was roughly half a mile back. Mind you, my father is 6'5" and 220 pounds, but I wasn't exactly light at the time, and he never showed any signs of slowing down, due to adrenaline, I guess. After this night, we never took late-night walks. He installed 4 bright motion detection lights around our plot, and brought home a dog. The few times I've tried bringing it up, he didn't want to discuss it, and he made that clear. Those figures still give me chills, and the image of the 3 huddled together is very vivid 15 years later in my mind. I was at this park with my girlfriend at the time that has a neighborhood on one side and a few miles of pretty dense forest on the other. We were stargazing, and as we sat in this opening near the neighborhood, I heard a rustling in the patch of shrubbery that sounded like a person stomping around. I immediately got up to investigate, as this area is known for sketchy activity. What I saw made no sense. I still feel like I imagined it or something. I saw what looked like a person hunched over with a white cloth over them walk out of the bushes and stand on the path that goes around the entire park. I turned to my girlfriend and asked her what it looked like without telling her what it looked like to me, and she described it exactly as I did. So we hightailed it out of there. We booked it to my car and got in, and I, wanting to know what it was, turned on the high beams in hopes that it would follow us. It did not. Now this is where the story gets even stranger. We went to another park because we wanted to continue stargazing, so we drove a few miles to essentially what is a giant field. We found a bench and sat down and managed to forget about that weird encounter. After about 10 or 15 minutes of this, we suddenly saw, not heard, mind you, what appeared to be a black helicopter fly over us in the direction of that first park. It was completely silent. No noise at all. I have not been able to find any pictures online that come close to what it looked like, but if you're familiar with Halo Reach, it looked like a falcon. This thing maneuvered like nothing I've ever seen. Granted, I don't know much about aviation, but it dipped over a tree line at an angle so steep we thought it was going to crash. The weirdest part of all is that there was someone else at this second park. An old woman walking her dog who didn't react to the plane/helicopter at all. It was by far the strangest night of my life. I've yet to return to either park, and I really don't plan on doing so. There's some really strange things out there. This all happened about 5 years ago. One night, a few of my friends decided after a night of hanging out that we'd go on an adventure at about 3 a.m. We took a ride about 50 miles to this old Spanish ruin in New Mexico that was once the seat of the Inquisition. I can't for the life of me remember what the place is called. So we jumped the front gate to the place and started exploring. One of my friends brought a flute with him and started playing it, and about 30 seconds into his, shall we say, mediocre playing, something started screaming really, really loud on the tops of the long destroyed walls of the place. It was going from wall to wall really quickly, screaming the most blood-curdling scream you've ever imagined. At that moment, we booked it and got the hell out of there, and drove for a few hours to Bandelier National Monument, where we planned to camp out for the rest of the weekend. We got to Bandelier at about 6 or 7 a.m. to set up our camp. After a few hours talking about what the hell happened at the ruins, I went to take a piss behind a tree about 300 feet from our camp. This is where everything started getting a little fuzzy. I remember seeing 2 dust devils coming my way, and when I turned around again, 2 of my friends were there, and they were motioning me to follow them. I couldn't help but to follow them, like I was being pulled behind them in shackles. I followed them for what seemed like 10 or 15 minutes, and then I snapped out of it. These couldn't be my friends. They had bright red hair with my friends' faces and cat eyes. Both of my friends were brunette. So I stopped walking, and they turned around and looked at me with the most terrifying gaze I've ever seen. Monsters in movies are nothing compared to this. I turned around and ran as fast as I could back the way I came from. After about 5 minutes of a full sprint, I got back to our camp. Everyone was still there, sitting around talking, and didn't even notice that I was gone. I told them what had happened with the look-alike Skinwalkers, and we packed up everything within probably 10 minutes and headed back to Albuquerque. For good.